What if I told you that ancient worship in Israel wasn't always as straightforward as you think? What if hidden beneath centuries of biblical tradition lies the story of a goddess who was once revered alongside the God of Israel? Prepare to question everything you thought you knew, because today we're uncovering the story of Asherah, a divine figure so controversial that for nearly a century, historians and Bible scholars refused to even acknowledge her existence. But that all changed in 1929 with the groundbreaking discovery of the Ugaritic texts. These ancient tablets revealed a rich mythology surrounding Asherah, forever altering our understanding of this mysterious goddess and her place in the ancient world. Asherah wasn't just a shadowy figure hidden in obscure texts. She was a powerful deity whose presence in the Canaanite Pantheon was undeniable. The Ugaritic tablets provided irrefutable evidence of a pre-biblical Canaanite religion that included well-known gods like Baal and Dagon, but also El, the high god of Israel, and his wife, Asherah. This discovery proved that the many references to Asherah in the Bible connected directly to this same goddess, suggesting a much more complex religious landscape than previously thought. Asherah's influence wasn't limited to the Canaanites. While she bore similarities to other ancient goddesses such as Ishtar of Babylon and Hathor of Egypt, each of these deities embodied distinct aspects of divine power. Ishtar, for instance, was a goddess of war and love, commanding the fierce passions of battle and romance alike. Asherah, on the other hand, symbolized creation, life, and fertility, qualities that made her a nurturing force of nature. This unique role set Asherah apart from the more warlike deities of the time, highlighting a transformation in the ancient world's understanding of divine power. Yet, like many ancient goddesses, Asherah's significance was eventually overshadowed by shifts in culture and religion, which sought to redefine divinity away from life-giving forces and towards figures of judgment and condemnation. But Asherah's story starts even earlier than the discoveries at Ugarit. Her name appears across ancient inscriptions, from the Hittite Empire to Mesopotamia and southwest Arabia. But it is in Israel that Asherah's story takes a surprising turn. While often described as a Canaanite deity, Asherah found a unique place in Israelite worship. Both archaeological evidence and the Bible reveal startling clues about Asherah's role in the authentic religious practices of Israel, even within the Jerusalem temple. Some aspects of her worship remain hidden in plain sight, obscured by scribal edits and narratives designed to conceal their true nature. As we embark on this exploration, all we ask is that you keep an open mind as we delve into the scholarship surrounding Near Eastern archaeology and biblical studies. We'll trace Asherah's entire story from her mysterious origins, the lands that revered her, and the places in Scripture where her legacy still lingers. The oldest known mentions of Asherah come from Mesopotamia, where she was known as Ashratu or Asheratum. In numerous inscriptions and cylinder seals, she is depicted as the consort of Amenru, a Babylonian god representing the West and known as the Lord of the Mountain Asheratu, bearing the title Lady of the Steppe. Symbolized her roots in the Amorite steppeland, but was also associated with mountains, much like her divine partner, Amenru. Babylonian records highlight her importance during the First Babylonian dynasty, the time of Hammurabi, himself an Amorite. During this period, Asheratu had her own temple and a dedicated priesthood in Babylon. Personal names incorporating Asheratum as a theophoric element also appeared frequently during Hammurabi's reign, indicating her widespread veneration. Historian Steve Wiggins points out that the name variant Asheratum aligns with West Semitic phonology, clearly indicating her Amorite origins. Asherah's veneration in Babylon persisted even into the Hellenistic era, where she sometimes merged with Ishtar and even gained associations with the netherworld. Although much of her early history in Menorah remains shrouded in mystery, Asherah's influence in her homeland is evident, especially through the legacy of King Abdi-Asherah, whose name means servant of Asherah. Abdi-Asherah was a prominent Amorite ruler in the 14th century, mentioned in no less than 52 tablets from the El Amarna archives in Egypt. Now, let's dive deeper into the story of how this once revered goddess, whose temples stretched from Mesopotamia to Israel, became a controversial figure intertwined with the very roots of Israelite faith and worship. How did her image shift from a nurturing mother deity to one associated with idolatry and condemned by later biblical texts? What does the story of Asherah reveal about the struggle between ancient traditions and the emerging monotheistic beliefs that shape the Bible we know today? And most intriguingly, what remnants of her worship remain hidden in the texts and landscapes of Israel? These were diplomatic letters that had been exchanged between the Egyptian pharaoh and various Near Eastern kings and governors during the Late Bronze Age. Asherah's popularity in the Bronze Age also ranged well beyond Menorah and Mesopotamia. She has a prominent role in the Hittite El-Qunirsa myth, which was discovered on a fragmentary tablet in Hattusa, the capital of the ancient Hittite Empire. This myth tells a complicated story of seduction and betrayal involving Asherah and the god El-Qunirsa, as well as the death and resurrection of the storm god Baal. The name El-Qunirsa might be derived from the Ugaritic El-Qunars, an epithet of the high Canaanite god that meant El, creator of the earth, and indeed, the entire myth was probably borrowed by the Hittites from the Canaanites. Asherah also became a major goddess in pre-Islamic southwestern Arabia, where she was called Athirat. According to one text, she shared a temple with Wad, a major deity of the kingdom of Ma'in. Another Arabian text associates her with Am, the national god of the kingdom of Caraban. Both Wad and Am were lunar deities, inviting speculation that Athirat was their solar counterpart. For now, there is no evidence of this. The Levant is where Asherah really came into her own. Thanks to the Ugaritic tablets found at Ras Shamra, we have a much better idea of who Asherah was and how she fit into the Canaanite religion. Asherah, called Athirat in Ugarit, was the consort of the supreme god El. The name Elat, meaning goddess, was also sometimes used for her. She was one of the deities who received sacrificial offerings in the Ugaritic offering lists, sacrifices of sheep, to be specific. Although El was the sole creator of earth, heaven, and mankind, Asherah participated in the creation of the gods, the 70 children of El, and bore the title creatrix of the gods. She is also called Lady Athirat of the Sea, in some texts particularly in reference to her status as the goddess of Tyre. In Canaan during the Late Bronze Age, we find numerous seals and figurines that represent the goddess Asherah. Canaan was ruled by Egypt during this period, and not surprisingly, her iconography often shows significant Egyptian influence. She sometimes holds lotus flowers or papyrus stems in her hands, and she often has shoulder-length hair in a style that resembles the Egyptian goddess Hathor. In some instances, she is shown standing on a lion. The Canaanite Asherah was associated with fertility, and her images often emphasized her pubic triangle along with a tree of life symbol. Over time, the goddess was often represented simply as a stylized tree, often a palmetto, typically flanked by ibexes or other caprids. The presence of animals feeding on the tree suggests a shift in emphasis from fertility to nourishment and blessings. a famous jug from a temple in Lachish, known as the Lachish Yor, is decorated with a tree flanked by caprits and an inscription that reads a present for My Lady Eilat. Pendants in the shape of stylized trees have been found at the same temple, and Near Eastern iconography expert Athmar Kell suggests that tree pendants were worn as symbols of Asherah. In much the same way that people in the West today wear gold crosses as jewelry. Two cult stands found in the village of Tanakh, Israel, depict a sacred tree flanked by caprits, and the more famous one shows the goddess Asherah flanked by lions in the equivalent spot on the bottom register. These date to the early Israelite monarchy, Iron Age 2a. According to Joshua 21:25, Tanakh was a Levite settlement. Some scholars believe these stands belong to a local cult devoted to Asherah. A bit later, in Iron Age 2 billion, we have examples of seals from around Palestine showing sacred trees flanked by worshippers, suggesting that Asherah continued to be venerated in tree form within the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. In Philistine territory and Judahite regions bordering the Philistines, we also find terracotta plaques with the image of a naked goddess that is assumed to be Asherah. We also find thousands of pillar-shaped goddess figurines throughout ancient Judah whose meaning and purpose are disputed but which many scholars interpret as a symbol of the goddess Asherah. Asherah was more than a goddess of myth and temple rituals. She was an intimate part of daily life for many ancient Israelites. Her presence could be felt in the simple offerings left by families at sacred trees or the small clay figurines tucked away in household shrines. These practices were not just acts of devotion, they were expressions of a deep-seated belief that Asherah walked among her people, offering protection, fertility, and blessing. This connection to the divine feminine provided comfort and stability, especially in a world where life was often uncertain and precarious. But as the priests of Yahweh sought to centralize worship and banish these ancient rites, they faced a culture that could not so easily forget the goddess who had nurtured them. In this clash, we see a struggle between the old ways and a new order, a conflict that would leave its mark on the spiritual identity of an entire people. Some of the most critical evidence related to Asherah from this period was found at a caravanserai along an ancient trade route just to the south of Judah. The location is called Cantalita Drud, and the shards of two large storage jars, called pithoi, found at the site have illustrations and inscriptions of interest. One depicts a sacred tree with flowers and perhaps fruit that two cards are feeding on. It is positioned above a lion and is believed to represent the goddess Asherah. 3 other shards were used as material for writing letters, and the messages inscribed on them include blessings in the name of Yahweh and Asherah. 2 of them refer to Yahweh as Yahweh of Teman, and the third calls him Yahweh of Samaria, implying that the travelers who wrote these messages were familiar with temples or shrines to Yahweh in those locations. One inscription appears above an illustration of a god and goddess with bovine features, and scholars debate whether the juxtaposition is intentional or coincidental. A 4th blessing that mentions Yahweh and Asherah was found on a piece of wall plaster from the site. A similar inscription is found at a site in Judah called Kerbet el-Kulm, which pronounces blessings in the name of Yahweh and his Asherah twice, according to Old Testament scholar Nick Wyatt. The goddess Asherah and her cultic representation were closely associated with the monarchies of Israel and Judah, which is why the topic of Asherah comes up frequently in narratives about royal politics. Furthermore, he believes that the Queen Mother might have been regarded as a royal avatar or incarnation of the goddess. The Bible is not a straightforward record of ancient Israelite religion. Most of the references to Asherah in the Old Testament are based on the Bible. Thus, as Tilda Binger observes in her book on Asherah, the Old Testament is a post-exilic theological school that advocated for the exclusive worship of Yahweh. Thus, as Tilda Binger observes in her book on Asherah, their knowledge of the religious practices of times past, that is, before the exile, was limited. Another challenge in understanding the Bible's Asherah references is that the text is often corrupt, and many passages differ greatly between the Masoretic Hebrew text used in our Bibles today and the ancient Greek translations that survive in the Septuagint. We have to look for linguistic and contextual clues to figure out what the original text was talking about. King Asa and the Queen Mother in Binger's book, she focuses on the passages that have the clearest references to Asherah as a goddess. One such passage concerns King Asa of Judah in 1 Kings 15 and 2 Chronicles 15. In the Hebrew of both passages, it says that as removed his mother Ma'akah as the Gebirah or palace administrator because she had made an image of Asherah, and then he burned the image in the brook of Kidron. However, the Greek translations of both passages are quite different, suggesting a different underlying source. The Greek of 1 Kings 15 gives the mother's name as Anna and uses a term of uncertain meaning to describe the images, plural, that Asa burned. The Greek of 2 Chronicles 15 retains the name Ma'akah, but states that the goddess she had served in her official capacity was Astarte rather than Asherah. Binger says these verses describe a palace coup rather than a religious reform, and she suggests that the real offense of the Queen Mother was having an idol of Astarte in place of Asherah, the official spouse of Yahweh. The 400 prophets of Asherah 1 Kings 18-19 reads as follows, "And now send out and bring all Israel to me at the mountain of Carmel." And the 450 prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah, who dine at the table of Jezebel. It's widely believed by scholars that this passage was originally only about the prophets of Baal, and the 400 prophets of Asherah were added later. This is interesting, says Binger, because it means that the goddess Asherah still enjoyed some measure of fame and popularity in the time of the Deuteronomists. Adding the prophets of Asherah to this story about Baal and the hated Jezebel might have been their way of discrediting Asherah, Manasseh's reforms the Judahite king. Manasseh instituted a number of temple reforms that are described in surprising detail, as Binger notes, while other bad kings are simply said to have done evil in the sight of Yahweh. 2 Kings 21 goes further by describing how Manasseh rebuilt the high places, built altars for the hosts of heaven, the Canaanite Pantheon, presumably, and made and installed an image of Asherah in the temple to Yahweh. The description of these acts begins in verse 3, with a verb meaning return that is normally used in the Bible to describe the reintroduction of the proper Yahwistic cult. Binger theorizes that the Deuteronomists were rewriting a text that was actually friendly toward Manasseh and believed he was rectifying the mistakes of his father Hezekiah by restoring Asherah to her place in the temple. At any rate, this passage confirms that an image of Asherah had been present in the Jerusalem temple. Incidentally, Manasseh enjoyed a remarkably long reign, minus 55 years. It's hard to avoid the conclusion that he was a popular and effective monarch. 2 Chronicles even rehabilitates Manasseh's reputation by telling a story in which Manasseh is taken captive by the Assyrians, repents, and is restored to his throne. Nothing of the sort happens in 2 Kings. Josiah's counter-reforms, according to 2 Kings 23, King Josiah, the grandson of Manasseh, imposed significant reforms on the temple and the populace. In verse 4, he removes the vessels made for Baal, for Asherah, and for the host of heaven from the temple, and has them burned in the fields of the Kidron. Asherah's transformation from a revered goddess to a demonized symbol in Israelite religion represents one of the most dramatic shifts in ancient spiritual landscapes. What once was a figure of nurturing and fertility, celebrated in sacred groves and revered alongside Yahweh, became a taboo, a representation of everything the new religious order sought to purge. The reforms of King Josiah were not just acts of religious fervor, they were a calculated effort to erase Asherah's presence, a deliberate attempt to redefine the spiritual narrative of Israel. By burning her symbols and tearing down her sacred sites, Josiah's campaign against Asherah reflected a deeper struggle, one that sought to suppress the power and influence of a divine feminine figure in favor of an exclusive, patriarchal vision of worship. Yet beneath these reforms, the whispers of Asherah's ancient power lingered, suggesting that her worship was never fully eradicated, but merely pushed into the shadows, waiting to be rediscovered. Verse 7 is translated by Binger as follows: "And he tore down the houses of the Kedeschim that were in the house of Yahweh, where the women were weaving, where the houses of Asherah were." This raises several questions. Who were the Kedeschim? Why did the Asherah cult at the temple have women whose job it was to weave fabric? Kedeschim is often mistakenly translated as prostitute, but the Hebrew root means holy or sanctified. The Kedeschim may simply have been cultic personnel who were not exclusive to Yahweh. According to Binger, there is no particular reason to think prostitution was a part of Asherah worship in the temple. As for the weaving, one scholar, Susan Ackerman, has argued that Asherah was, in addition to her other roles, the Israelite goddess of spinning and weaving. Ackerman points out that in the Hittite myth of El-Qunursa, Asherah holds a spindle with which she attempts to stab Baal. In the Bible, the wisdom woman of Proverbs is described as a weaver and seamstress, and many scholars think this woman is deliberately patterned after Asherah, since she is present with Yahweh at creation and described as a tree of life, which recalls not only the story of Genesis 3, but also the stylized trees that represent Asherah in the iconography of ancient Canaan and Israel. Archaeology seems to corroborate the connection between Asherah and weaving. The excavation at Tel Ta'anak, which we've already noted was associated with Asherah, discovered some 62 loom weights and other weaving tools, meaning that this religious sanctuary was also an important textile production center. Textile production workshops associated with Asherah have also been found at 7th century Ekron. If the analysis of Baruch Halpern is correct, the Jerusalem temple then might have been home to a textile production center overseen by the Asherah cult. Despite the reforms that were allegedly carried out by Josiah, there are reasons to think Asherah's legacy never totally went away. In fact, two key temple objects that are associated with the proper Yahweh's cult in the Old Testament may actually have originated with Asherah veneration. First, it needs to be pointed out that the majority of the Bible's 40-odd references to Asherah are not direct references to the goddess herself, but are instead references to cultic objects called Asherim associated with Asherah. Although scholars debate the exact nature of these objects, they seem to have been stylized trees or poles, or perhaps even trees that had been cut and pruned in a specific way. We know they were made of wood and stood upright because numerous passages talk about cutting them down and burning them. Unfortunately, since wood does not survive long periods of time, archaeologists have yet to find any good examples of surviving Asherim. However, we may have some ancient depictions of similar objects. An ancient Greek vase depicts an altar with a palm branch, and a Tyrian coin shows two masabat, or standing stones, with an incense altar and ornamental tree. In fact, many of the sacred trees shown in ancient Israelite inscriptions might actually be representations of these Asherim, like this ornate 7-branched tree with blossoms and almond-shaped fruit drawn on the storage jar at Kuntilat-Adrud. We also have good reason to think these Asherim were commonly placed in the Jerusalem temple, and perhaps even in the inner sanctuary, since Deuteronomy 16 goes out of its way to prohibit the placement of Asherim beside Yahweh's altar. You shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar that you make for Yahweh your God, nor shall you set up a stone pillar that Yahweh your God hates. The things that Yahweh hates, of course, are quite subjective, since stone pillars or masabat, which were an indigenous part of Israelite culture, are regarded positively in many non-Deuteronomistic passages. Now, let's consider the menorah. The story in Exodus 25 explaining the menorah's official origins is a priestly text, which means it was produced after the exile and after the Deuteronomistic literature. It specifies a 7-branched lampstand made of gold and decorated with almond flowers. In an important study on the menorah published in 1971, L. Yarden argued that the menorah was deliberately stylized as an almond tree as a way of suppressing or combating the Asherah cult. This implies that Asherah worship was still a major part of Israelite culture during the early Second Temple period. But why is the menorah specifically designed to represent an almond tree? In the Near East, the almond tree is apparently the first to blossom in spring. In Israel, it blooms in January or February, while other trees are still bare. It has been linked to the mother goddess since ancient times. Its Latin name, Amygdala, probably comes from the Semitic Amigalu, meaning Great Mother. In biblical Hebrew, the almond tree was originally called Luz. It is still called Luz in Arabic today. Significantly, Luz is the name given to the place where Jacob dreamed of steps going up to heaven in Genesis 28. Upon waking, he set up a sacred stone and named the place Bethel, the house of El. In the Bronze Age, Bethel was the site of a religious sanctuary dedicated to a goddess, probably Asherah. Several goddess plaques of the kind originally mentioned were found here, along with a Hathor column. The Jacob story legitimizes the site's cultic significance. Later, the Ark of the Covenant is said to have rested at Bethel on its way to Shiloh, and 2 Kings 23.15 claims that there was still an Asherah pole at the Bethel altar during the late monarchy. J.E. Taylor points out that neither Amos nor Hosea denounced the Asherah at Bethel, suggesting that it was considered to be an acceptable part of the cult of Yahweh, until the Deuteronomists decided otherwise. In summary, the Israelite version of the Asherah pole was probably, at least in some cases, either a sacred living almond tree or some kind of wooden pole made from an almond tree. The ancient city of Luz, with its historical devotion to Asherah, was an important site throughout Israel's history. Even though the Aaronite priests did away with Asherah worship in the Second Temple, they kept her beloved symbol, the stylized almond tree with 7 branches. 2. Shake. There is a second Hebrew word for almond, shaked. In the book of Jeremiah, the prophet is looking at a rod made from an almond tree, which gives Yahweh an opportunity to make a pun. And the word of Yahweh came to me, saying, Jeremiah, what do you see? And I said, I see a rod of almond. Then Yahweh said to me, you have seen well, for I am watching over my word to perform it. Perhaps Jeremiah was not observing just any almond rod, but one specific almond rod, one that had not yet received its biblical origin story. In number 17, we read about a singular botanical miracle. Yahweh commands Moses to take a staff from each tribe and to set them before the Ark of the Covenant in the tent of meeting. When Moses returns to the tent the next day, Aaron's rod has produced buds, blossoms, and ripe almonds. From that day on, Aaron's blossoming almond staff was to remain in front of the Ark of the Covenant, to be kept as a sign to defiant people. Many commentators have observed that the purpose of this story is undoubtedly to establish an ideology for an object that was familiar to its audience. That object must have resembled a flowering staff and would have been kept inside the temple sanctuary. In a recent paper, Old Testament scholar Carol of Andertorn states that the temple had an important role in popular religious devotion. It performed many of the same functions as medieval cathedrals did. Believers could bring and leave behind votive gifts, and the temple would also house various objects to commemorate miraculous events. In the case of Aaron's rod, the narrative of number 17 would make little sense unless its readers had been to the temple and knew of the object it was referring to. Van der Toorn further notes that staffs were used both to symbolize authority and to authenticate the staff's owner. Accordingly, he proposes the following scenario. In pre-exilic Israel, the temple in Jerusalem housed a holy rod, stylized in the form of a blossoming almond branch. We should probably think of an oblong stick with decorations in the shape of almond flowers, the whole rounded off by an elongated knob like a bunch of almond leaves. Nobody knew for how long it had been there. In a time when nobody could be certain about the origins of the almond rod in the temple, the author of Numbers 17:16-26 came up with the idea that this was in fact Aaron's rod, miraculously transformed overnight. He was led to make this identification by association with the staff or scepter that the priest on duty was normally carrying. The rod in the temple, interpreted as Aaron's staff, was declared to symbolize the divinely endorsed privileges of the priestly elite. In consequence, the far more humble scepter of those who served in the sanctuary underwent a rise in status. Henceforth, the staff of the priest could be traced back to the rod of Aaron, just as the serving priest was allegedly able to trace his genealogy back to the Aaronites. This rod may go quite far back, since 2 Kings 21 tells us that King Manasseh had placed an Asherah in the temple of Yahweh. Rena Eichler argues in a recent paper that this Asherah was a stylized tree, much like the drawing found at Kuntilata Drud. In fact, that drawing might depict the very same Asherah set up by King Ahab in Samaria. It would still have been in the Sumerian temple at the time the drawing was created. Eichler also points out that Asherah is invoked in the Khirbet el-Qom and Kuntilata Drud inscriptions to pronounce blessings using identical language to the Aaronite blessings found in the Book of Numbers. One of Asherah's functions in ancient Israelite religion was to be a mediator for Yahweh's blessings, and the stylized tree motif represented the idea of blessing and nourishing, as previously mentioned. Furthermore, although the priestly passages of the Pentateuch condemn idols and standing stones, they never mention the Asherim. Similarly, Ezekiel, who is closely tied to the priesthood and priestly literature, condemns high places and altars, but never the Asherim. This suggests that Asherim and their almond tree symbolism remained important to the post-exilic temple and its Aaronite priesthood, even though a different ideology was eventually proposed for the temple's Asherah staff. There is much we still don't know about Asherah, including the reasons that she fell out of favor in Israelite religion. A fascinating analysis of the Book of Hosea by W. Dibowitz suggests that the earliest version of the text was actually about Yahweh's divorce from Asherah. Hosea is famously difficult to interpret. It has undergone numerous revisions and expansions, making it difficult to reconstruct the message of the original prophet. Chapter 2 contains a long divorce speech. It assumes the role of a husband challenging his children, "Defend your mother, defend her, for she hereby is not my wife, and I hereby am not her husband." Witt says this language matches divorce proceedings from other Near Eastern texts. Chapters 1 and 3 of Hosea seem to make it clear that the target of this divorce is faithless Israel, who is described as a whore, using Hosea's marriage to the prostitute Gomer as an analogy. However, Witt points out that it is the children of Gomer who symbolize Israel, not Gomer herself. Furthermore, the language about prostitution is the work of a Deuteronomistic redactor who interpreted the divorce speech as a speech about Israel. After stripping away the Deuteronomistic revisions and other verses he identifies as late additions, which shows that the divorce passage is much more ambiguous. If this text dates back to pre-exilic Israel, it comes from a time when the average Israelite and Judahite believed Asherah to be Yahweh's wife. Furthermore, the metaphor of gods being the parents of the humans was a common way of thinking throughout the Near East. Humans were never described as the spouse of a god. After ruling out other alternatives, Witt concludes that Hosea was writing about the divorce between Yahweh and Asherah. Asherah's role as fertility goddess explains the fertility imagery used throughout Hosea's speech, says Witt. And because Asherah was the mother goddess and was believed to be Yahweh's wife, it is natural that she should metaphorically be viewed as the mother of the Israelites. Just as Yahweh is thought of as the father of the Israelites, the sin of Israel in this metaphor was the adoption of fertility rites, in which Asherah became Baal's sexual partner. In Hosea's view, Asherah was committing adultery, and by making Baal their father instead of Yahweh, they became bastards, as Hosea 2.4 puts it. The declaration includes punishment for Asherah as well. She is stripped of her jewelry and clothing, and Asherah must lose her favored status in Yahweh's temple. Interestingly, it is not the Jerusalem temple in view here, but the temple in Gilgal, which Hosea is concerned with. Witt speculates that this divorce might also have been Hosea's attempt to explain the loss of Gilgal and the province of Megiddo to the Assyrians in the 730s or 720s BCE. Even after most of the Hebrew Bible had been written, scribes continued to remove references to Asherah from the text. One possible example was pointed out by Francesca Stavrakopoulou on the 2011 TV special The Bible's Buried Secrets in Deuteronomy 33.2. In today's Bibles, this poetic verse about Yahweh reads, "From his right hand went a fiery law for them." This odd wording makes no sense, either on its own or within context. However, the words fiery law eshta become Asherah if you flip the dalet to a fresh one. These two letters look almost identical and are often confused. Furthermore, the Greek Septuagint reads angels instead of fiery law. This translation is possible if the Greek translator misread the text as Ashar Elim his mighty ones, when it originally said Asherah. Another strange example is found in Ezekiel 8. In this text, Ezekiel is taken in a vision to the temple court, where he beholds the glory of God at the seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes jealousy. There he observes the abomination of women weeping for the god Tammuz nearby. So what is this image of jealousy, and why would the glory of God be there? Margaret Barker convincingly argues there is an obvious corruption of the text here. The phrase "the image of jealousy" was originally meaning the image of the creatress, the title of a theorat at Ugaritic. In other words, Ezekiel's remembrance of the temple was that it contained an image of Asherah, and he seems to associate this image positively with the glory of Yahweh, while at the same time condemning the counterfeit Tammuz cult. And as we have already noted, Ezekiel never condemns Asherah or the Asherah objects, unlike some of the other prophets. R. Worthington concludes in a recent paper that it is no longer possible to dismiss Asherah as only a bad idolatrous outside influence which God's prophets sought to fight against. The Bible does not attempt to cover up the existence of Asherah, or that it was worshipped in Israel. From the archaeological evidence and the biblical evidence, we can trace the veneration of the wife of God and the Queen of Heaven, from her roots as an ancient Amorite goddess to the symbols of divine trees and almond branches found in ancient Israel, and the Bible's own testimony that she had a place in the house of Yahweh for most of its existence, even after the exile, when the new temple was built. We see tension in how the religious establishment continued to honor her symbols, even as it developed new origin stories for those symbols that were more compatible with their Yahweh-only theology. Yet, Asherah's legacy did not end with the destruction of her sacred groves. Her symbolism found a way to endure, subtly influencing the religious imagery of the centuries that followed. Even in early Christian art, the almond-shaped mandorla that surrounds depictions of Christ may trace its origins back to Asherah's sacred tree. Could it be that the ancient veneration of the divine feminine left a shadow that even the Christian world could not fully erase? The shape of the menorah itself, with its 7 branches and almond blossoms, serves as a silent testament to the tree cults that once flourished in Israel's sacred past. What other symbols have we inherited without fully understanding their roots? These lingering echoes of Asherah invite us to consider how the stories of forgotten gods continue to shape our spiritual landscapes, even when we no longer speak their names. Perhaps it is no coincidence that even in early Christianity, the shape of the almond symbolized the purity of the Virgin Mary, and Christ himself was sometimes enclosed in an almond-shaped halo in Christian art. Thanks you for watching. If you found this exploration of Asherah intriguing, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into biblical history and the mysteries of ancient religion. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the content and leave a comment below with your thoughts. What do you think about the story of Asherah, and how do you believe her legacy has influenced modern spiritual beliefs? Your insights might just lead to our next great discussion.